Hi everyone, welcome back to Talent Order's Breakfast Briefing. This week I'm joined by Scott Corzine, Senior Managing Director at Ankura Consulting Group. Scott, thank you so much for joining me this week. I really appreciate you taking the time, as I know you're very busy. Before we go into any questions, can you give the audience a bit of background on your career history so they understand why I may be asking you these questions?
Well, Amy, good morning. Thanks for having me. So back in 2004, I formed a business called Risk Solutions International with a number of partners from the risk management business. We built that business as an operational risk and resilience consulting firm. It was acquired later by FTI Consulting, and then we moved that practice from FTI to Ankura Consulting in 2016, where we reside and focus on several areas of business in that space. We look at cybersecurity risk management. We look at business continuity and disaster recovery, crisis management, enterprise risk management, those kinds of things, helping organizations deal with and plan for the bad things that inevitably happen, especially around cyber and the cyber impact.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. So yeah, an expert for my questions that I've got today, so thank you. How has the current economic climate affected the cyber market?
Well, I think the most obvious impact has been the COVID-related challenge that have been presented. So globally, most people are still working from home. Some organizations are beginning to return to work. So it presents several kind of interesting interconnected business continuity and cyber issues. It's kind of a triple whammy because you have workers that could not work from home. These may be telephone center workers, call center workers, retail workers, food service workers, folks in factories that had to work. So that group of folks have been at risk having to do their jobs with masks on, with social distancing, with new kinds of process protections, and that puts them at risk in a certain way. You then have the rest of us that have been working from home, as you and I currently are, and that opens up a whole cybersecurity panoply of risks because we're using our own devices often. They may not be connected to the network in a way that the IT or the security department wishes they were. How we manage our passwords at home, how secure our home ISPs are, and our connections to our laptops and our pads are all subject of great concern to most chief information security officers. So there's a whole work at home set of threats that are far more dangerous from a cyber perspective than when you're in the more safe confines of the office network. So I think that's introduced risk. And I think the third whammy of the triple whammy is that this has placed boards, both their pandemic response to COVID-19 and their whole cyber posture is putting boards at increased risk for actions from shareholders and from regulators about how they've exercised or not exercised well their fiduciary duty of care to have helped their organizations foresee that something like a COVID pandemic was coming and to prepare from a cyber perspective for this kind of diaspora of workers working from various locations that they control less well than they do within the network. So I think COVID has been, an obvious big issue. While that's going on, all the regulatory regimes are still intact, right? HIPAA's not going away for the healthcare industry, and the defense industry in the U.S. now faces a regulatory regime called CMMC, which is a much more much tougher cybersecurity standard for the 300,000 companies that are direct or indirect suppliers to the U.S. Defense Department. So all of these regulations continue to be strengthened, continue to be at play, and so you're facing these COVID-related issues in a world where the regulators aren't going away and aren't giving you a pass in most cases. So I think the ability to keep up with this whole new paradigm of a persistently remote workforce is something that's not going to be temporary. I think many companies are going to decide that certain job functions and roles worked really well from home. Why bring them back to the office? Why not take our office space from 12 floors to 9 floors? Not good news if you're a commercial real estate or a building owner, but good news from a cost perspective. So I think you're going to see CISOs and IT departments really put their heads together and think about how do we kind of expand the endpoints that we're used to protecting to the fact that we're now working from home, and make sure we feel that the IT environment is as safe with this persistently permanent kind of workforce at home as it was, as it was in the pre-COVID days. And I guess my final point to your question is, you're going to see a continued move to outsourcing. You're going to continue to see more folks go to managed services for cost reasons, for security reasons. If I can put elements of my security program on secure platforms that have already been approved by the federal government, like FedRAMP, and then automatically I can answer regulatory issues by outsourcing to managed services, cloud-based services. So I think you're going to see an increase to those things and an increased risk concentration because so many organizations are depending on those same core providers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many more things we do now, and working from home brings on a lot of risk. But yeah, absolutely. That does actually bring me on to the next question. What should the cyber executive be doing more of in these challenging times?
I think the answer is to think about cybersecurity less as a technology solution or a technology problem, and more as an enterprise risk problem. That's how we have always viewed cybersecurity. Sure, there are technical controls and there's lots of technology behind good cybersecurity, but if you think about cyber from an enterprise risk perspective, I think the cyber executive, whether he or she is a chief information security officer, chief security officer, or if it's embedded in the IT function, I think raising the game from seeing this as a set of technical solutions and technical controls to building cybersecurity from the top down. What is our business strategy? What markets do we want to get into? What products are we launching? What new audiences are we addressing? What new risks do those moves, those business moves, those strategic business decisions, what new risks do they impose to how we manage the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, which of course is the CIA of security. And I think when you do it that way, you get away from best practices and benchmarking. Let me be as good as my competitor, and you get more to a right-sized philosophy where I want to do things that's right for this organization, for this company, for this division, for this operation, based on its unique risks. So I think moving to a risk-based approach that starts with what's the business strategy, what are the inherent risks from an information security perspective to that business strategy, what risks can I mitigate by avoiding them or transferring them through insurance and other mechanisms and controls that I put in place, and how do I manage those residual risks, and then how do I layer my defenses around what are my crown jewels, what are the less sensitive assets that I'm protecting, and what are the least sensitive assets, because you can't put a moat deep enough or wide enough across every one of your digital assets. You just don't have that kind of budget unless you're, Citibank or Chase. So you have to do this intelligently from a risk-based approach. And I think seeing cybersecurity as a strategic set of business decisions is more helpful than seeing cybersecurity as the technical guys that keep us safe.
Absolutely. And that does kind of come onto my next one. So has the current climate affected how cybersecurity is being viewed by the board? And if so, how?
Well, I think that most boards have, I'll say this generously, have a knowledge deficit, a cybersecurity knowledge deficit on the board. And folks in the executive search business know this. Boards face both an internal issue of having at least somebody on the board that's versed enough in cybersecurity to ask the CISO intelligent questions. Because if you can't develop the cadence of that conversation, then the board's not going to be well equipped to understand what the issues are, what the problems are, how well to fund the cyber initiatives that they need to fund. So I think there's a board competence issue that remains a big challenge for headhunters, for executive search firms, and for the recruiting committees for boards, the nominating committees. We need to get more of that, but there's a global shortage of people that know this stuff. And that's the second part of the problem is in the senior management ranks, you also face this global shortage of 2 million or so, based on whose numbers you're reading, of good senior cybersecurity people. So everyone wants the best. The banks tend to have them. It's a seller's market, and we're explaining to our clients that you need to understand what the market value of good senior cybersecurity people are, or cybersecurity able board members. Be prepared to pay for them, because when you think about today's enterprise, 80% of all of enterprise assets are digital today. Mm-hmm. They're not plant and equipment and cranes and forges and machine tools. There are in some industries, obviously, but across the board, 80% of corporate assets are digital. And so protecting those digital assets is absolutely, a raison d'etre of every risk management committee, every cyber committee. And so I think paying attention to board level competence in cyber and reaching out and putting those kinds of players on the board is I think a key to keeping up their fiduciary duty of care. Because what we do know today is that given that asset array, we know that we've got hacktivists, we've got opportunists, we've got people that are stealing things for the old-fashioned reason that they can sell information on the web for a profit. We have destructive ransomware that brings you from a digital company to an analog company. We have nation states that are attacking us. The tradecraft is extremely sophisticated, and in many cases, the bad guys can be one step ahead of the good guys. So I think looking at this from a leadership perspective, I think is job number one, and ensuring that the enterprise is cyber prepared and spending what it takes to be cyber prepared for the size company you're dealing with, the industry sector you're in, and the kinds of assets you're protecting, is key. So I think these are leadership issues, and I think they're training issues. I think companies have to do a much better job generally of bringing cybersecurity into the job description of everyone at the organization, because it's human frailty that is at the root of most successful attacks. And you solve that with training, repeat, train, repeat, and train. So I think those are the big issues.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's so important to have that training for everybody, but also, really skilled cybersecurity professionals within your business to ensure that you are protected. Should the worst happen, you get hacked or somebody gets into the trials or whatever happens, it's really, really important that you are protected, and it should always be on the forefront of the board's mind to make your business as successful as you like. But if you get hacked, somebody else can take that as success. So yeah, really, really good point there. How do you believe the role of the cyber executive is going to change over the coming months?
Well, I must say I've been overly optimistic about this in the past, and I'll probably be over optimistic about this today. But I think, to our last point, I think the best kind of cyber leadership in the organizations that my firm deals with view cybersecurity in the lens that we talked about, from an enterprise risk management lens. They view the cyber executive as a senior member of the management team. But all too often, the cyber executive is seen as a cost center, as someone who inherently is going to slow down productivity and put steps and little obstacles in the way, right? You go from single factor authentication to dual factor authentication, and the CISO has now introduced another step. I can't get into a share file unless my phone rings and I put in a code to make sure I verify it's myself. If you think about it, it takes about 6 or 7 seconds to do that, but we're productivity minded. And I think that shifting the organizational view of the cybersecurity executive from the person who's slowing me down, the person who's costing me money, the person whose efforts and expenditures are hard to analyze from an ROI perspective, needs to become this person is a senior level risk management executive when you think about it, because the person's charged with understanding the business, understanding how the operations of the business work, understanding the data flows and the handoffs of data, and understanding all the regulatory regimes that the chief risk officer and the chief compliance officer understand. This person has to know all that stuff and still preside over an organization that has good technical people that do know how to operate the SOC and do security operations and patch management and all those kind of technical things. He also has to, or she also has to, be someone who's good at training and understand how they train the rest of the organization. So I think seeing the security function as a legitimate business management function, and not just the group we put up with because we have to do this, it is still really in its infancy. And I think progressive organizations get it more and more. Less progressive organizations apparently need to be attacked more often and see the downside of ransomware and the downstream impact of a successful cyber attack and to kind of wake up. So I think that's happening slower than I'd like to see it. I also think that the cyber executive is getting more and more involved in business continuity. We've always seen, a link of these two things, because when you look at destructive ransomware, for instance, you look at the Sony hack from the Koreans a couple of years ago. They didn't steal anything. They didn't make any money off that. They just punished a company that had angered them because of a movie. And they reduced a sophisticated digital company to an analog company, sending scripts in hard copy to stars to read because they couldn't email them for about a year. rebuilding every single device from the ground up. So that becomes a business continuity issue. So even when you look at cybersecurity insurance coverage, you have to look at that through the lens of business interruption and contingent business interruption insurance. And the CISO needs to understand that, along with the compliance officer and the chief risk officer and the person buying the insurance, because it's as important to expect the successful cyber attack, because all our defenses can't work all the time, and be ready with resilience plans and recovery plans, which are the province of business continuity and continuity of operations planning, and make sure we're buying insurance in those areas to make sure that we're covering our foregone profits during the period that we're down. So I think good cyber tries to be as defensive as it can be, but also has to be really good at response and recovery, because it's inevitable that our organizations are going to be successfully hacked. So I think a good balance of prevention and interception before the fact, balanced with an expectation that we're going to be successfully hacked, and we have really good plans to recover. And to tie this all together to your first question, COVID is a great illustration of most organizations being radically unprepared for what should never have been seen as a black swan event, but was, because we knew this was coming. We'd been warned by the epidemiologists for years, but many companies didn't have a plan in place. So I think the beauty of the bad preparation for COVID-19 from a cyber perspective is, I think it's awakened the board to realize you really do have to have a plan in place for these predictable events, and cyber attacks are predictable, and having those response and recovery plans, assuming that all of our defenses weren't necessarily successful.
Absolutely. I think the link is really important as well, because, you know, there's so much defense, which of course is really important, but there needs to be plans for if you are hacked or when you are hacked. So yeah, really good point. They are all of my questions for today. Thank you so much for taking part. I'm sure our viewers will find it really interesting and helpful, actually. I hope so.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for having me, and I enjoyed our chat.
Great. If anybody has any further questions for Scott or any ideas for things you'd like to hear about next, please email me on amy.morris@talentorder.com or message me on LinkedIn. If you missed last week's briefing with Thomas Kroll, I'll leave the link down below. I hope you're all staying safe and well. I'll see you next week. Bye.